A couple of years ago, I contemplated taking my own life. I was in a stressful situation in regards to my academic work, which led to the decline of my physical health, social life, and overall motivation to do anything. In addition, the uncertainty of my future, combined with the extreme disadvantage people like me have in the job market, made me think that my existence was a waste of space. I was good at hiding it, and I only talked about it to my mother and best friend openly for the first time several weeks after I completed my studies. 2 years later, and my life has improved drastically to the point of completing a master's degree in the span of a year. I got out of that rut, thanks to friends, family, mentors, and video games. And that's why I care so much about video games. I care that the industry provides the entertainment and joy that is incredibly unique to experience. I care that it also showcases the power of technology for entertainment. And I care that the medium can not only explore the dark and sensitive subject matter that other mediums have created, but excel beyond traditional mediums' execution by allowing interaction. Unlike the other mediums, having to create a product that explores such subject matter is something that's a challenge for writers, level designers, programmers, and artists. When it comes to the exploration of mature themes in video games, design has faced a complicated question of how to marry the two together. It has to not only be an engaging narrative, but one that complements the unpredictable movements that the audience is bound to experiment with. Games need to use the medium to their advantage, by having the gameplay complement and strengthen the narrative, rather than contradict it. And finally, the game and narrative needs to both embrace and reject conventions in order to elevate itself into greatness. That's why Spec Ops: The Line succeeds, because it uses the standards of the time to examine the possibly problematic image of the military in popular culture. It's also why Valkyria Chronicles fails when it comes to looking at concentration camps, because it's also trying to evoke the anime aesthetic to a T. Back in August of last year, I examined the unpredictable nature of mental conditions in a previous video, and with some free time on my hands, I thought I would take a look at the other condition I had to overcome in video games. Unlike autism, depression has had more attention in recent years, and has been covered by numerous outlets, especially in the wake of the 2014 Gamergate controversy. The most famous example, and by far the most controversial, is 2013's Depression Quest. The game feels like a noble attempt to emulate the struggles someone with depression has in making choices, by contextualizing them with gameplay. It's the most mechanically heavy of the three examples I will mention, but it also has a problem with its presentation. The tone of the game tries to evoke the dreariness and sadness of the situation, but its color scheme and music only evoke boredom and emptiness. It gets to the point where bringing in your soundtrack would evoke a more appropriate tone, while also helping you get through how predictable and underdeveloped the writing in front of me is. The status at the bottom of each page seems to hammer the message that we are depressed in an obnoxious manner, bordering on patronizing. It's on every screen, and I think it would have been better if those were removed altogether. The name itself, Depression Quest, preemptively encourages us to select the best possible outcomes, leading us down a predictable path that begs for some unexpected twists and turns. Not that choosing a diverting path would do anything, since the game doesn't go far enough in the exploration of the condition in terms of outcomes. The format is inconsistent and badly thought out that the game places hyperlinks to flesh out these characters in a jarring and abstract manner. The character we play as serves as a shell, but it's hard to take the premise seriously when we already have a comfortable life with health insurance, a job, a family, and a girlfriend. I know that depression is an invisible blight and can strike even the most well-off people, but I personally think it would have been better if the lead was constructed like Commander Shepard was. We can tailor the faceless character towards our personal backgrounds, which would make the narrative far more hard-hitting. In other games, this sort of thing would be expensive, but Depression Quest is both text-based and free-to-play, meaning that the developer wasn't aiming to put it on sale. When I first played this, it made me angry, but upon replaying it, I just felt unengaged and bored. The game doesn't use the wonderful medium of video games to deliver the message effectively, which means that better examples like The Static Speaks My Name is already off to a bright start. The Static Speaks My Name is a short free game that came out last year, but has generally kept itself under the radar with the exception of two fairly popular videos by colourful content creators. There's much more personality in this game, and it has already intrigued me into what the developer might do next. The setting is right, and the individual situations has us on a path to destruction that we have no control over. But it isn't perfect, nor do I consider it a good exploration into the condition, even though it's far more interesting and engaging than the previous example. The game tries to convey a tone, but instead delivers a confusing mixture of tones that contradict each other. There is equal evidence that this guy we play as is depressed, or that he's someone who's escaped from a psychiatric facility, or that he's some kind of Buffalo Bill character. What would have evoked the tone of a depressing and lonely game like Silent Hill 2 instead comes across as odd on par with Deadly Premonition. It can be interpreted in different ways, and the lack of a clear narrative focus made the ending feel like I was missing something. I do recommend both games as some sort of educational tool for game design, but not for the writing, because the problems I have can be ironed out through improvement and criticism. The nameless self-insertion was an obstacle to fully immersing myself into these worlds, which on a surface level shouldn't be hard considering I was, in one form or another, living through some of the same situations and same moods which they were aiming to convey. Looking at this condition from a first-person perspective in both camera and writing was misguided at best, which was something Actual Sunlight solved immediately by looking at the situations from the third person. It's about a struggling writer stuck in a dead-end job where the corporate structure screws him over at any given opportunity. We learn this through the mundane and minimalistic gameplay offered through RPG Maker, while having the story presented like we were reading some of the characters' past work. The unpredictability of depression would be difficult to convey through a nameless self-insertion character without some sort of random number generator energy meter, but the third-person perspective allows the developer to tell a very personal story that isn't destroyed by the player's behavior. A player's awkward movement suits the environment, and it's something the developer anticipated. Despite it being so wordy, the writing is solid enough to be entertaining to read by itself. It didn't need anything complex on a mechanical level to bring its message across, because the third-person perspective alone puts the player in an observational position rather than being the subject themselves. That random number generator suggestion I highlighted earlier would improve those first-person games, because the sufferer's actions can depend on how much will they wake up with. From my personal experience, it depends on factors like the previous day's events, without any solid mathematics to perfectly predict what I could and couldn't do. That little bit of programming would convey the misery of being unable to get out of bed through mechanical methods, because the exposition would no longer be needed as the situation is already contextualized. That's good for first-person games, but that sort of thing wouldn't be suitable for third-person games. While I do recommend Actual Sunlight for being an engaging product, it suffers the same problem that both Depression Quest and Static also have. The problem is that the gameplay doesn't reinforce the narrative, but is instead a vital crutch for the narrative to support itself on. If you can't get engaged mechanically, then the story completely breaks down, since progression is either impossible or a slog if you decide to neglect it. And if you can't get into the narrative, then what does the gameplay have that can't be offered in more polished forms elsewhere? Having the theme be the point of the game risks collapsing in on itself, because you limit yourself to what you can write and develop. The subject shouldn't be abandoned altogether, but it shouldn't be the point of the product. If you take a look at Telltale Games' The Walking Dead, one of the major themes in the latter episodes of the first season explores one character coping with depression which impacts the overall story about the group of survivors hoping to find a better life for themselves. The gameplay is thematically separated from that story, since it acts as a way for Lee Everett to contribute to the individual arcs, instead of being a direct contributor to the theme. Which is why, when it comes to exploring depression in video games, Wolfenstein: The New Order is likely the best example of depression done right. It's a stretch, but let me try to explain. The previous examples relied on us being open to looking at depression, and as a result we were left with no surprises. Wolfenstein instead puts the theme on the back burner, and is used to flesh out our main character while it engages us through other means. The point of Wolfenstein's existence is to be a silly alternative history game with a heart of gold. The game is about Nazis ruling the world, and it's up to us to stop them, or at least hinder them, and that simple narrative is achieved by being a character study for those involved. I think the reason why I appreciate Wolfenstein more than the other games is because it takes the storytelling angle of Actual Sunlight and sets it in an absurd situation. If you listen to Blazkowicz's dialogue and inner monologues, you are essentially hearing two different people. On the surface, he is a hard-working patriot willing to go into the hornet's nest to save the world, but deep inside he is a tired, exhausted man who rationalizes the actions we partake in. The only reason why he keeps up with the facade is because it gives the other members of the circle hope. The thoughts we hear when something dire happens to either us or the supporting cast is somewhat realistic despite its setting. Its biggest achievement is that the gameplay isn't the story and the story isn't the gameplay. The actions of the player contextualize the narrative and vice versa, but you don't need to be engaged in both of them to get your money's worth. The first time I played this was filled to the brim with absolute joy, while also caring deeply about what was going on in the bigger picture. On my second playthrough, I looked at how these characters were constructed. It has a light-hearted chemistry with a dark and tragic undertone, and that's why Depression worked here, because it's a game mostly about the opposite. The wackiness of blasting through a concentration camp on a robot with the undertone of deep personal cynicism serves to be one character's exploration through his personal hell. For a condition as broad as this, I am still ridiculously happy that they managed to hit it right out of the park, and it's hard to think how anyone can beat this. Fortunately, there is a starting point for aspiring developers. I had a chat with a friend about the subject, and he and I agreed and disagreed with some of the things that I have pointed out in this video. One of the things he said resonated with me, and it actually changed the context of this entire video, and it personally tells the difference between Depression in games done right and those that do it wrong. If you are making a game about a subject matter that is as broad as Depression, then you have already failed. If the game is aiming to be a message about the condition, then it's likely you will not succeed. Focus on the tone, and build the narrative and themes around it.